Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are doing something a little different, jumping right into a data set that completely shattered how I view economics.
Yeah, it's a really eye-opening report.
Totally. I mean, we are looking at this massive, comprehensive analytical report on Honduras spanning from 1950 all the way to 2024. And it's focusing on national wealth, income distribution, the whole economic machine.
Right. And we're analyzing this purely objectively, just letting the data speak.
Exactly. No political sides, just the numbers. And the core mission of our deep dive today is to unpack a really wild paradox.
The growth illusion.
Yes, the growth illusion. Because for decades, Honduras has seen this really significant increase in its net domestic product, or NDP.
Which we should probably clarify really quickly for everyone listening.
Oh, definitely. Because you turn on the news and it's always GDP, right?
Yeah.
Gross domestic product.
Right, yeah. GDP is just raw output. It's the total value of everything produced. But NDP, net domestic product, that takes the GDP and actually subtracts the depreciation of capital assets.
So it's like factoring in the wear and tear.
Exactly. The aging infrastructure, the machinery breaking down.
Yeah.
So if NDP is growing, which it is in this data set, it means real tangible wealth is being created.
Yeah.
The pie is legitimately getting bigger.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the pie is getting bigger, but the data shows this brutal, counterintuitive truth. Every point of economic growth seems to be actively accelerating the poverty of the vast majority of the citizens.
Yeah, it's not a rising tide lifting all boats.
Not at all. The wealth isn't trickling down, it's like escaping upward.
Escaping upward is a great way to phrase it. It's a structural inequality machine.
So how does an economy grow while its people actually feel poorer? I mean, you look at the macro context, and it starts with the sheer number of people standing at the table, right?
Right. The demographic data here is, well, it's staggering.
It really is.
What's fascinating here is if you look at the window between 2001 and 2015, the population of Honduras skyrocketed from about 6.75 million in 2001 to over 9 million by 2015.
Wait, adding over 2 million people to a base of under 7 million in roughly 14 years?
Yeah, it's an explosive demographic expansion.
But people always say a growing population is good for the economy, like a demographic dividend.
A demographic dividend only works if you have the industrial capacity to instantly absorb those people into productive jobs. But look at the 2011 data.
Oh, right, the adult population stat.
Exactly. In 2011, the adult population, so anyone over 20, was about 4.23 million.
Meaning adults were less than half of the total population, like 49.5%?
Right. The majority of the country was under 20. That is not a dividend. That is a massive dependency ratio.
So to put this in perspective for you listening right now, imagine you're baking a pie, and every year your pie gets 10% bigger. That's your economic growth.
Sounds great on paper.
Yeah, sounds great. But at the exact same time, your dinner guest list triples.
Right.
Nobody at that table feels like they're getting more food. If anything, they're starving.
Because it's diluted growth. The resources are being stretched so thin across this massive youth demographic that needs housing, food, education, all before they can even enter the workforce.
Right, so the per capita NDP growth for the adults, the ones actually doing the work, is completely watered down. Imagine trying to stretch your current paycheck across 3 times as many dependents.
It creates an incredibly fierce labor environment, which leads directly into how the income is actually distributed.
Yeah, the income pyramid. Because the pie is stretched thin, but the slices are not being cut equally at all.
Not even close.
So if we look at the 2021 pre-tax national income share, who is getting the biggest piece?
The top 10%. They capture the vast majority of the income.
And the bottom 50%.
They are squeezed into this statistically tiny, almost microscopic sliver of the national income.
I mean, the average pre-tax income for that top 10% drastically eclipses the national average. But that national average is kind of a fake number then, isn't it?
It's mathematically skewed, yes. When the top 10% pulls in that much, the mean average gets dragged way up. It makes a country look richer on paper.
While the reality for the bottom 50% is a total lack of bargaining power.
Exactly. Because of that massive population boom we just talked about, there's an overabundance of labor. If you are at the bottom, you have zero leverage to demand higher wages. You are entirely replaceable.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because income is just what you earn in a year. The report transitions to what people actually own. Wealth.
Right. Wealth concentration is the deeper issue.
The 2021 data isolates the top 1% family wealth share. But then it zeroes in on the top
It's
0.01%.
the absolute apex of the pyramid.
Yeah. And the top 0.01% possesses thousands of times the wealth of an average family. Thousands of times.
Which is a fundamental destruction of class mobility.
How so? Like just mechanically?
Well, wealth is compounding capital. The bottom 50% spends all their income just to survive. They don't invest. They don't buy assets. But that top 0.01%, their wealth is so vast it generates its own gravity.
Right, it just earns money by existing.
Exactly. It means the game is effectively won by a microscopic fraction of the population before the bottom 50% even starts playing.
Wow, so if wealth is just aggressively concentrating at the top, what is happening to the people actually doing the labor, the ones generating that NDP growth we talked about?
We have to look at the national wage share from 1980 to 2015.
Okay.
Over that 35-year period, the national wage share in the national accounts did not rise in sync with NDP growth.
Wait, really? So the economy is growing, output is up, but wages aren't?
In some years, the wage share actively declined.
I mean, wait, if the factories are making more and the businesses are selling more products, why aren't the paychecks reflecting that? Where is that extra value going?
That is the core of the labor compensation problem. Economic growth in this system translates almost exclusively into capital gains, rather than labor compensation. The owners of the businesses keep the surplus.
Oh, wow. So the worker gets nothing extra for being more productive.
Exactly. And the data from 2015 really highlights this. The average private wage for an adult was $93,175.
And if that nominal wage is barely moving, inflation is just eating away at their purchasing power year after year.
Yes. And this raises an important question about the middle class. Because it's not just the bottom 50% suffering here.
Right. The report talks about the middle 40%.
The middle 40% is traditionally the stabilizing force of any society, the consumers, the taxpayers. But the data set shows this steady, chronic leakage in their income share over the decades.
Their piece of the pie is shrinking too.
Completely overshadowed by the explosive growth of the top 10%.
So for you listening, think about that middle class squeeze in your own life, that feeling of working 50, 60 hours a week, doing everything right, and just feeling like you were running on a treadmill, you were working harder just to stay in the exact same financial spot.
Because you're trying to outrun a structural deficit.
Right. And where is all that concentrated capital at the top actually going? Because they have to park it somewhere.
And they parked it in real estate.
Yes. The housing asset shift. This part of the report blew my mind. Going from shelter as a human right to shelter as a pure commodity.
The historical contrast is really stark. Look at the data from 1980.
Okay, 1980, the average value of government housing was just $2,119.4.
Right. Now contrast that with the modern data. By 2024, the average value of private housing skyrocketed to an absolutely staggering $120,351.4.
From about 2,000 to over 120,000.
Because the state systematically withdrew from providing housing security.
It's like playing a game of Monopoly, right? Imagine the bank just suddenly stops building those little green community houses, and one player, the top 10%, just buys up all the properties on the board.
Yeah, that's exactly what financialization looks like.
They turn a basic human need into an exclusive luxury. And if you don't own a home in this data set, you are essentially moving backward because you're paying rent.
And rent is a wealth transfer. If your wage is stuck near that $93,175 mark we mentioned for 2015, and housing prices are rocketing toward $120,000, you can't buy. So you rent from the top 10%.
Meaning your stagnant wages are paying their mortgages, you are building their equity while your net worth stays at zero.
It massively exacerbates the wealth deficit for the unpropertied class.
So what does this all mean for the government's role? If the government isn't spending on housing anymore, how are they using their fiscal levers to help the bottom 50%?
Well, let's look at the 2021 Social Security expenditure.
Okay.
The expenditure per adult averaged only $1,316.6.
Wait, 1,316.6, that's nothing, compared to a housing cost of $120,000 though.
It's practically a rounding error. And if you stack the government's direct expenditures, housing, health, defense, education, Social Security, the direct expenditure on housing is virtually non-existent.
How can a government budget be so entirely detached from the actual struggles of the vast majority of its people?
It points to a total absence of distributive justice. In a functional macroeconomic system, the tax code acts as a shock absorber. It takes from the fat to pad the lean, so to speak.
Right, taxing the top to fund social programs for the bottom.
Exactly. But here, the fiscal lever is broken. The safety net is what we'd call a leaky barrier.
A leaky barrier. I like that term.
It means that if anyone in the middle class or below faces a severe illness or simply reaches retirement age, they face catastrophic economic risk. There is no net to catch them.
So if there's no safety net and wages aren't going up and housing is unaffordable, how are average people even surviving day to day?
Debt.
Debt, of course, the debt shadow.
Yeah, the data set tracks national assets against national liabilities from 1970 to 2020.
And it shows that while total national assets peaked, meaning the country on paper got richer, total national liabilities, the debt surged simultaneously.
Because when your income doesn't cover your basic subsistence, you leverage your future labor. You take on private debt to bridge the gap.
So think about this. Imagine your net worth looking great on paper because maybe the value of your house went up, but in reality, your credit cards are maxed out just to buy groceries every week.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it creates what we call the double dilemma.
The double dilemma.
Right. Domestically, the population is drowning in private debt. When you are paying massive interest on basic survival debt, your consumer spending drops. You can't participate in the wider economy.
Which drags the whole domestic market down.
Yes. And globally, the second part of the dilemma, the gap in living standards compared to the U.S. and the EU remains an insurmountable chasm.
The report mentions the 1960 to 1964 Living Standards Index based on purchasing power parity, or PPP, right?
Yes, U.S. and EU PPP. It measures what your money actually buys in terms of real goods. And Honduras has chronically stayed below the 1.0 mark on that index.
Meaning, despite all this NDP growth over 70 years, the average citizen is no closer to a developed world standard of living.
They're economically marooned.
That is just bleak.
Yeah.
But wait, we always hear that foreign direct investment, FDI, is the holy grail for a growing economy like this. Politicians love cutting ribbons at new foreign factories. Are you saying FDI is actually hurting?
It's a dual-edged sword. And we have to be objective about how it functions in this data set.
Okay, let's look at the 2021 data on that. Capital compensation per capita reached an all-time high of 110.3. That sounds like a massive win for foreign investment.
It does. Foreign companies bring in initial capital, build infrastructure, hire local labor.
Yeah.
The output spikes. But you have to look at the next metric. Net foreign financial assets.
Which historically have been negative.
Exactly. Why is it negative?
Yeah.
Because of the massive repatriation of profits.
So the foreign company makes a ton of money using cheap local labor, but they don't keep that money in Honduras.
They send the profits back to their headquarters in North America or Europe. It acts as a wealth pump.
A wealth pump?
Right. It drains the net national wealth right out of the country. The GDP looks great because production is happening, but the wealth leaves.
And there are hidden costs to that production too, the environmental side.
Yes. The industrial and financial expansion comes with severe environmental degradation. The data implies a really grim reality here.
The rich get the capital compensation, and the poor inherit the carbon footprint.
The environmental bill is left entirely with the local population, who, as we've established, have no healthcare safety net to deal with the fallout.
So the profits cross the border, and the pollution stays in the local water supply.
Essentially, yes.
I mean, when you bring all these data points together, it's like looking at the blueprints for a machine.
A cohesive mechanical understanding of structural inequality.
Right. And you broke this down into 3 specific gears, right? The 3 gears of the inequality machine. Let's walk through those because it makes it so clear that this isn't accidental.
No, it's inevitable under these conditions. Gear 1 is the asset gear.
The housing crisis.
Right. The absolute privatization of housing and the withdrawal of the government from real estate. It forces the bottom 90% to pay wealth-building rent to the top 10%.
So that's the asset gear.
Yeah.
Wealth moves up through rent. What's gear 2?
The allocation gear.
Which is the stagnant wages.
Yes, the long-term stagnation of wages, failing to keep up with output and NDP. By keeping labor compensation artificially low, it guarantees that the working class can never accumulate enough surplus to buy into the asset gear.
They can never save enough to buy the house, so they are trapped. And then the 3rd gear.
The fiscal gear.
The government's failure to intervene.
Exactly. The chronic lack of transfer payments. A safety net that is completely incapable of reversing the Gini coefficient. Instead of taxing the top to relieve the bottom, the state does almost nothing.
It's brilliant in a really terrifying way. I just marvel at the architecture of the data here. It's not just a bad year or a bad decade or one bad policy. It's an effectively designed machine that moves wealth in only one direction: up.
And it forces us to reconsider what we mean when we talk about a successful economy.
So, what are the takeaways from this report? How do you even begin to dismantle a machine like this?
The report is very clear on its policy suggestions. First, implementing strict wage protection systems. Labor compensation has to be legally tethered to productivity growth.
Right, if output goes up 10%, wages have to go up.
Exactly. Second, massive fiscal reform. The government must prioritize housing and Social Security to hedge against wealth polarization.
They have to start building community housing again.
They do. Ultimately, the report concludes that the country's future depends entirely on restoring dignity to the bottom 50%. Total growth means nothing if distribution is ignored.
Breaking the illusion that GDP growth automatically equals human well-being. I want to connect this back to you listening right now, because wherever you are listening from, the metrics governments use to boast about a good economy, they so often hide the reality of the people actually living inside it. Look at your own local GDP, and then look at your own local wage growth.
The patterns are rarely isolated to just one data set.
They really aren't, and I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder on your own. Something outside the direct numbers we talked about today. If a nation's ledger says it is getting phenomenally richer, but the pockets, the homes, and the lived reality of 90% of its citizens say they are getting poorer, at what point do we admit that the word economy has completely stopped referring to the people entirely and now only refers to the capital? Think about that. We will see you next time.